In our age of moral relativism and ideological chaos, one truth stands as firm as granite: the existence of a moral order that transcends human will and governmental decree. This is natural law, not the arbitrary construct of human reason, but the reflection of divine wisdom embedded in the very structure of reality. Yet modern liberalism, in its arrogant presumption, denies this foundation upon which Western civilization has stood for millennia. Today, we witness the catastrophic consequences of this denial: societies unmoored from eternal principles, drifting toward the rocks of tyranny and dissolution. The liberal mind, intoxicated by the fantasy of human perfectibility, rejects the notion that there exists a moral order independent of human preference. This rejection strikes at the very heart of what makes us human: our capacity to discern right from wrong through reason illuminated by divine grace. Without natural law as our guide, politics becomes mere power struggle, justice becomes arbitrary preference, and freedom dissolves into license. But for those who understand the permanent things, natural law remains our North Star, pointing toward the transcendent order that alone can sustain human flourishing. Chapter 1: The Eternal Foundation of Moral Order. Natural law represents the intersection of divine wisdom and human reason, providing the immutable foundation upon which all legitimate human law must rest. In my years of studying the great conservative tradition, from Cicero through Aquinas to Burke, I have witnessed the consistent recognition that human beings possess the capacity to discern moral truth through rational reflection upon our nature and purpose. This is not the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment philosophers, but reason properly understood, human intellect operating within the context of divine revelation and accumulated wisdom. The classical understanding recognizes that natural law emerges from our created nature as rational beings ordered toward the good. We do not invent moral principles, we discover them through careful observation of human flourishing across cultures and centuries. The prohibition against murder, the obligation to honor contracts, the duty to care for the innocent, these are not arbitrary social conventions but reflections of truths written into the fabric of reality itself. When Sophocles' Antigone defends divine law against the tyrannical decrees of Creon, she appeals to principles that were not born today or yesterday, they live forever, and no one knows their origin. This is natural law, the eternal foundation that enables us to distinguish between legitimate authority and mere force. Modern liberals, however, reject this foundation in favor of what they consider progressive alternatives. They substitute human will for divine wisdom, individual preference for moral truth, and utilitarian calculation for principled reasoning. The result is the moral anarchy we witness today: abortion defended as choice, marriage redefined by judicial fiat, and traditional virtues dismissed as oppressive prejudices. Without natural law as our guide, every moral question becomes a matter of power rather than truth, leading inevitably to the tyranny of whoever possesses sufficient force to impose their preferences upon others. Chapter 2: The Liberal Assault on Transcendent Order. The modern liberal project represents a systematic assault upon the very concept of transcendent moral order. Beginning with the nominalist philosophers of the late medieval period and reaching its crescendo in the French Revolution, liberalism has sought to replace divine authority with human autonomy as the ultimate source of moral and political legitimacy. This represents far more than a mere political disagreement; it constitutes a fundamental rebellion against the nature of reality itself. The liberal mind cannot tolerate the existence of moral truths that constrain human will. Where natural law teaches humility before divine wisdom, liberalism preaches the sovereignty of individual choice. Where natural law recognizes objective standards of right and wrong, liberalism embraces moral relativism disguised as tolerance. Where natural law acknowledges the reality of human nature with its inherent limitations and proper ends, liberalism fantasizes about the infinite malleability of human beings through social engineering and ideological indoctrination. This assault manifests itself most clearly in the liberal approach to law and governance. Rather than viewing positive law as the application of eternal principles to particular circumstances, liberals treat law as an instrument of social transformation divorced from any transcendent foundation. They speak of evolving standards of decency and living constitutions precisely because they reject the notion that moral truth remains constant across time and circumstance. For the liberal, law becomes whatever serves their vision of progress, regardless of its consistency with natural justice or traditional wisdom. The consequences of this approach are evident throughout our society. When judges abandon natural law principles in favor of sociological jurisprudence, they transform courts from guardians of justice into engines of social revolution. When legislators ignore the moral law in crafting policy, they create legal systems that war against human nature itself. When educators reject objective truth in favor of relativistic ideology, they produce graduates incapable of moral reasoning. The liberal denial of natural law thus undermines the very foundations of civilized order, leaving society vulnerable to the chaos of competing subjective preferences backed by force. Chapter 3: The Democracy of the Dead confirms natural law. Tradition, properly understood, represents the democracy of the dead, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who have grappled with the eternal questions of human existence. When we examine this vast repository of human experience, we discover remarkable consistency in moral insights across diverse cultures and historical periods. This consistency points unmistakably toward the reality of natural law as an objective feature of the human condition rather than a merely subjective preference or cultural construct. Consider the universal recognition of certain fundamental principles: the obligation to honor one's parents, the duty to speak truthfully, the requirement to keep promises, the prohibition against unprovoked violence. These moral insights appear in every major civilization precisely because they reflect truths embedded in human nature itself. The Decalogue given to Moses, the natural law philosophy of Aristotle, the jurisprudence of Roman civilization, the moral theology of medieval Christendom, all bear witness to the same fundamental realities. What strikes the thoughtful observer is not merely the existence of these shared insights, but their persistence despite the constant pressure of human passion and convenience. Every generation faces the temptation to abandon moral constraints that interfere with immediate desires. Yet the great traditions consistently resist this temptation, recognizing that certain principles cannot be violated without destroying the very foundations of human community. This resistance demonstrates that we are dealing with something more substantial than mere convention or preference. Modern liberals, however, treat this accumulated wisdom with contempt. They dismiss traditional moral insights as outdated prejudices reflecting the ignorance and oppression of earlier ages. In their arrogance, they presume that their generation has achieved unprecedented moral enlightenment that justifies discarding the tested wisdom of our ancestors. This represents a form of chronological snobbery, the assumption that later is necessarily better, that progress automatically accompanies the passage of time. The conservative mind recognizes that while circumstances change, human nature remains constant. The moral challenges we face today, the tension between individual desire and social responsibility, the balance between freedom and order, the relationship between material prosperity and spiritual fulfillment, are the same challenges that have confronted every generation. The accumulated wisdom of tradition provides invaluable guidance precisely because it represents the distilled experience of countless individuals and communities who have wrestled with these eternal questions. To reject this wisdom in favor of contemporary prejudices dressed up as progress is to choose ignorance over knowledge, arrogance over humility. Chapter 4: Natural Law and the Transcendent Order. The deepest truth about natural law is its foundation in transcendent reality, the divine order that gives meaning and purpose to human existence. Natural law is not merely a human construct designed for social convenience, but a reflection of the eternal law governing all creation. This understanding distinguishes authentic natural law theory from its various secular counterparts that attempt to ground moral obligation in purely natural or rational foundations. Throughout the great tradition of Western thought, natural law has been understood as participating in divine wisdom. For Aquinas, natural law represents the rational creature's participation in the eternal law of God. For the American founders, natural rights were endowed by the Creator and therefore possessed an authority that no human government could legitimately violate. Even Burke, with his characteristic caution about metaphysical speculation, grounded his defense of natural rights in divine providence and the moral order established by the great lawgiver. This transcendent foundation explains why natural law possesses binding force that mere human agreement cannot provide. If moral obligations were simply matters of social contract or utilitarian calculation, they would possess no authority beyond human consensus and could be changed whenever circumstances seem to require it. But natural law derives its authority from the divine source of all legitimate authority, making it both universal in scope and permanent in duration. The secular alternatives offered by modern liberalism inevitably fail to provide adequate grounding for moral obligation. Social contract theories must explain why individuals should honor contracts that become inconvenient. Utilitarian calculations must account for situations where individual happiness conflicts with general welfare. Rights-based theories must justify why certain rights deserve protection when they conflict with democratic preferences. Each approach ultimately dissolves into subjective preference or arbitrary power because it lacks transcendent foundation. Only natural law grounded in divine authority can provide the stable foundation necessary for genuine justice and authentic freedom. When we recognize that moral principles reflect divine wisdom rather than human preference, we acknowledge obligations that bind our consciences regardless of personal convenience or social pressure. When we understand that natural rights participate in divine authority, we recognize limits on governmental power that no democratic majority can legitimately transgress. When we embrace natural law as our guide, we submit to a higher authority that liberates us from the tyranny of subjective will and arbitrary force. Chapter 5: The Natural Order of Human Diversity. One of the most profound insights of natural law theory concerns the reality of human diversity within unity. While all human beings share the same fundamental nature and are therefore subject to the same basic moral principles, natural law also recognizes that individuals possess different talents, vocations, and stations in life. This natural diversity serves the common good by ensuring that society benefits from the full range of human capabilities and contributions. Yet modern egalitarian ideology, in its rejection of natural law, seeks to eliminate these beneficial differences through forced leveling. Natural law teaches that equality consists not in identical circumstances or capabilities, but in equal dignity before God and equal subjection to moral law. Every human being possesses infinite worth as a creature made in the divine image, regardless of their particular talents or social position. This fundamental equality coexists with natural inequalities of ability, temperament, and vocation that serve providential purposes in the ordering of human society. Consider how natural law illuminates the proper understanding of human relationships. The family, as the fundamental social institution, reflects natural hierarchies based on age, experience, and responsibility. Parents possess natural authority over children not because of arbitrary power, but because of their natural capacity and obligation to guide immature persons toward moral and intellectual development. Similarly, teachers possess authority over students, masters over apprentices, and experienced craftsmen over novices, not through domination, but through the natural order that enables the transmission of wisdom and skill. Modern egalitarianism, however, views all such hierarchies as oppressive impositions that must be eliminated. In educational settings, this produces the absurdity of treating inexperienced students as equals to learned professors. In families, It undermines parental authority by suggesting that children's preferences deserve equal consideration with adult wisdom. In society generally, it attacks every form of natural excellence as a threat to artificial equality. The conservative understanding recognizes that genuine freedom requires the preservation of natural diversity within moral unity. When we acknowledge natural differences in talent and vocation, we create space for individuals to develop their particular gifts in service of the common good. When we honor legitimate authority based on wisdom and experience, we ensure the transmission of valuable knowledge across generations. When we respect natural hierarchies grounded in moral purpose, we prevent the chaos that results from treating all preferences as equally valid. Natural law thus provides the framework for what we might call equality in inequality, the recognition that human beings can be equal in dignity and moral responsibility while remaining appropriately unequal in function and authority. This understanding alone provides the foundation for a free and ordered society that respects both individual worth and social coherence. Chapter 6: Prudent Politics and Natural Justice. The application of natural law principles to political life requires the virtue of prudence, the ability to discern how eternal principles should be applied to particular circumstances without compromising their essential character. This prudential approach distinguishes genuine conservative statesmanship from both rigid reactionism and revolutionary radicalism. While natural law provides unchanging principles, their application must account for the complexities of human society and the limitations of political action. Throughout my study of conservative political wisdom, from Burke's opposition to abstract revolutionary schemes to the American founders' careful balance of idealism and realism, I have observed the consistent recognition that politics is the art of the possible within moral constraints. Natural law provides the non-negotiable framework within which political prudence must operate, but it does not dictate specific policies or institutional arrangements. The same principles of justice might be applied differently in different societies depending on their particular circumstances, traditions, and capacities. Consider how natural law illuminates the proper approach to legal and constitutional questions. The principles of natural justice, respect for life, protection of property, fulfillment of contracts, punishment proportionate to crimes, remain constant across time and circumstance. But their implementation through specific laws and institutions must account for varying social conditions. A simple agricultural society and a complex industrial economy might both honor property rights while organizing their legal systems quite differently. This prudential approach explains why authentic conservatism avoids both the extremes of rigid traditionalism and revolutionary innovation. Against reactionaries who would preserve every historical practice regardless of its conformity to natural justice, conservative prudence recognizes that some traditions represent corruptions that should be reformed. Against revolutionaries who would sweep away all inherited arrangements in favor of theoretical perfection, conservative prudence acknowledges that existing institutions often embody wisdom accumulated through centuries of experience. The liberal approach to politics, by contrast, oscillates between utopian schemes and arbitrary pragmatism precisely because it lacks the stable foundation that natural law provides. When liberals embrace ideological programs, whether socialist, feminist, or environmentalist, they typically ignore the constraints of human nature and social reality in pursuit of abstract ideals. When they abandon ideology in favor of pure pragmatism, they have no principled basis for distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate political action. Only an approach grounded in natural law can provide both the moral guidance necessary for just governance and the prudential flexibility required for effective political action. Natural law tells us that government exists to protect natural rights and promote the common good, but prudence must determine how these purposes can best be served in particular circumstances. This combination of principled foundation and prudential application enables conservative statesmanship to preserve what is valuable while correcting what is defective through organic development rather than revolutionary destruction. Chapter 7: defending the permanent things against temporal fashions. The ultimate test of any political philosophy lies in its ability to distinguish between the permanent things that deserve preservation and the temporary fashions that will inevitably pass away. Natural law provides this crucial discernment by grounding political judgment in eternal principles rather than contemporary preferences. Throughout the centuries of upheaval that have marked modern history, those societies that maintained connection to natural law principles have preserved their essential character while adapting to changing circumstances, while those that abandoned these foundations have suffered devastating dissolution. In my decades of observing American political and cultural development, I have witnessed repeated cycles of intellectual fashion that promise revolutionary transformation but deliver only confusion and decay. Each generation of progressives announces that they have discovered new truths that invalidate the wisdom of their predecessors. Each wave of reform promises to create heaven on earth by eliminating the outdated constraints of traditional morality and constitutional government. Yet invariably, these movements produce results opposite to their stated intentions: programs designed to help the poor create permanent dependency. Educational reforms intended to improve learning produce widespread ignorance, and sexual liberation movements that promise fulfillment create widespread misery and social breakdown. The pattern repeats because these movements share a common error: they attempt to build human society on foundations other than natural law. Whether they ground their programs in materialist philosophy, scientific positivism, or therapeutic psychology, they ultimately rest on the quicksand of human opinion rather than the solid rock of eternal truth. When the inevitable failures become apparent, rather than questioning their fundamental premises, they typically respond by demanding more radical applications of the same failed principles. Natural law conservatism offers a different approach. It recognizes that human beings have been essentially the same throughout history, rational creatures capable of moral choice but limited by sin and ignorance. It acknowledges that the fundamental challenges of human existence, the need for order and freedom, justice and mercy, individual development and social cooperation, remain constant despite technological and social changes. It therefore looks to the accumulated wisdom of successful civilizations rather than the untested theories of contemporary ideologues. This does not mean blind adherence to every historical practice, but rather careful discrimination between essential principles and accidental features. The permanent things include the natural law principles that make human flourishing possible: respect for human dignity, protection of natural rights, recognition of moral responsibility, cultivation of virtue, and acknowledgement of divine authority. Temporary features include particular institutional arrangements, technological applications, and cultural expressions that may legitimately vary according to circumstances. The great challenge facing each generation is to preserve the permanent things while allowing appropriate adaptation to new conditions. This requires both intellectual humility, recognition that we are not wiser than all previous generations, and practical prudence, the ability to apply eternal principles to contemporary situations. Those who possess this wisdom become guardians of civilization, ensuring that the precious inheritance of ordered liberty passes intact to future generations despite the constant pressure of ideological fashion and political convenience. Conclusion. Natural law stands as the eternal foundation that no amount of liberal sophistry can finally destroy. Though temporarily obscured by ideological clouds, these truths persistently reassert themselves because they are grounded in the nature of reality itself. Every attempt to build society on alternative foundations ultimately crashes against the unchanging requirements of human flourishing. The conservative mind recognizes this pattern and therefore maintains fidelity to natural law principles even when they appear temporarily defeated by popular opinion or political force. For those who would defend the permanent things in our age of confusion, the path forward remains clear. We must study the great tradition that has preserved natural law wisdom through previous crises. We must cultivate the intellectual virtues necessary for sound moral reasoning. We must practice the prudential judgment required for effective political action. Most importantly, we must maintain confidence that truth will ultimately prevail over error, order over chaos, and justice over arbitrary power. The liberal denial of natural law represents a temporary aberration in the long story of human civilization. Our task is to preserve the flame of truth until sanity returns, knowing that the permanent things endure precisely because they rest upon the unshakable foundation of divine wisdom reflected in the moral order of creation.